thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And before I begin, I'd like to thank Danielis and Nancy and John and others who have made it possible for me to be here today to talk about this large topic, poetry, metamorphosis, and the evolution of consciousness. There's quite a lot in that title. Some of it I will treat in more sort of general terms, and then it will hopefully you'll find that the lecture gets more concrete as I proceed. So in this talk, I would like to present some of the ideas and thinkers who have influenced the way in which I see the philosophical and historical significance of modern poetry, and also illustrate some of the ways in which I have explored these matters in my own poetry. In particular, I want to discuss how poetry can overcome our sense of disconnection from nature, reconnect spirit and nature, and bring to light the meaningful interconnectedness of the world that otherwise remains hidden. Two thinkers are particularly important to the ideas and poetry I will share today. The first is Owen Barfield, whose thought is deeply connected to Rudolf Steiner's spiritual philosophy known as anthroposophy, which Steiner first articulated within the context of the German Theosophical Society at the beginning of the 20th century. The second is the great German poet and scientist of the Romantic era, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. More specifically, I will discuss Barfield's understanding of the evolution of consciousness, poetic imagination, and metaphor, and draw on Goethe's understanding of metamorphosis and my own poetry to deepen these considerations. And you'll see, poetry might seem like a limited topic. I hope I demonstrate that the poetic imagination has a very broad significance. So Owen Barfield, some of you may know of him, others not, was a philosopher, writer, poet, scholar, and solicitor. He studied at Oxford University and was a member of the literary group, the Inklings. I'm sure many of you know of this group. Some of its most famous members were Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who was a close friend of Barfield's. After retiring as a solicitor in 1959, Barfield taught at universities as a visiting professor in the US, and his many writings on the themes of language, poetic imagination, and the evolution of consciousness have received attention and praise from many writers and academics. And these include the US poet laureate Howard Nemerov, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Saul Bellow, literary critic Harold Bloom, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, and C.S. Lewis, who referred to Barfield as the, quote, best and wisest of my unofficial teachers. So two closely connected ideas in Barfield's thought are the evolution of consciousness and the significance of the imagination. In these respects, Barfield's thought is closely connected to Steiner's, but Barfield gave special attention to the pertinence of these ideas for a deeper understanding of the evolving historical meanings in language and for a deeper appreciation of poetry. Both Barfield and Steiner think that the power of imagination can be deepened into a form of gnosis, in other words, into an organ of spiritual insight that transcends ordinary intellectual consciousness. Their elevated conception of the imagination is continuous with views held by a number of Romantic poets and thinkers, or thinkers from that era, including Coleridge and Goethe. You also find similar ideas in Paracelsus and Jacob Boehme, and some of you are probably familiar with Henri Corbin's work on Sufism, where the imagination plays a very central role there. So their ideas about imagination are closely connected to these other traditions and thinkers. So both Barfield and Steiner also emphasize that the step towards developing this capacity of imagination is to intensify and become more deeply aware of the activity of our own thinking. In his major philosophical work from his early period, The Philosophy of Freedom, Steiner already attributes a foundational significance for our cognitive life to thinking, and shows that ordinarily we're not aware of thinking as an actual process or activity. We only become aware of our thinking at the moment it turns into thought. And he asks the reader, calls on the readers in this book to try and observe their own activity of thinking in the very process. In his Theosophical and Anthroposophical work, Steiner outlines many meditative practices which, through diligent practice, along with the moral development of the individual, can lead to an expansion and transformation of our cognitive powers. And more specifically, he presents 3 levels of cognition above that of intellectual knowledge. And the first of these he calls imagination, the other 2 inspiration and intuition. So I'm going in broad outlines into imagination and evolution of consciousness here to sort of set the stage for how Barfield develops these ideas. So some of this might be familiar to some of you. Imagination, as the word suggests, involves thinking in images. This image character of imagination makes it akin to dreaming. But whereas dreaming is characterized by a diminishing of conscious awareness, imagination involves a heightening of awareness. Steiner's view is very similar to Corbin's articulation of the creative imagination as a kind of intermediate consciousness that mediates between the sensible world and the spiritual world. In imagination, spiritual realities reveal themselves indirectly in the form of symbolic images. It is only at the level of what Steiner calls inspiration and intuition that these realities are grasped in a more immediate way. Nevertheless, the imagination stands higher than the usual intellect we're familiar with today and that's at work in science and philosophy. So in Barfield, there are similar ideas, but there's a particular attention to the imagination, its role, and particularly in connection to language and poetry. Whereas modern intellectual consciousness is only really suited to grasping the non-living physical world, just as it is only aware of thinking once it becomes a product, once it dies into thought, as opposed to thinking as a living process, albeit a spiritual one. Imagination, which Steiner sometimes calls living thinking, is able to penetrate into living nature. Already in Goethe's approach to biology, especially morphology, Steiner found a path towards enlivening thinking and perception. Goethe himself claimed that to understand nature, we must, this is quoting Goethe now, remain as quick and flexible as nature. And he spoke of the possibility of participating spiritually in it, that is, nature's creative processes. It is also at the level of imagination that deeper connections between all phenomena become apparent between microcosm, macrocosm, the universe and the human being. So whereas for our ordinary discursive intellect today, we tend to see the world as disconnected in terms of disconnected physical objects, imagination reveals the world as interwoven with meaningful relationships, what in esotericism are often called correspondences. While Steiner became a significant influence on Barfield, Barfield was already forming related ideas about imagination and the evolution of consciousness before he encountered Steiner's thought. His seminal work on the poetic imagination, Poetic Diction, began as his B.Lit thesis at Oxford University in 1922. And following his engagement with Steiner's thought in the early 1920s, Barfield continued to work on this manuscript, which was published in 1928. Barfield tells us that 2 experiences laid the foundation for this book. The first of these experiences was in his early 20s. He had experienced an intensified appreciation of certain passages of lyric poetry, which had to do with an intensification of the experience of the meaning of individual words through their poetic form, their poetic combination. And he came to call this a felt change of consciousness, like a shifting consciousness that he experienced through poetry. And this shifting consciousness or felt change of consciousness was at the same time connected to a transformation in his perception of reality, including nature, history, and art. And this led him to the conviction that the poetic imagination was not a matter of mere fantasy, but a source of meaning and a faculty of cognitive insight. So the second key experience was through his study of philology, in particular the history of words and their meanings, the way the meanings of words change over time. And this is the subject of his 1926 book, History in English Words. And through this study, he began to be convinced that there was an evolution of consciousness, that consciousness had evolved. Subsequently, after discovering Steiner's work, he said that he realized this was a very closely related but far more developed approach to the evolution of consciousness and imagination. And he states that, quote, "My most daring and, as I thought, original conclusions were his premises." Goes on to say, "An anthroposophy included and transcended not only my poor stammering theory of poetry as knowledge, but the whole romantic philosophy. It was nothing less than romanticism grown up." So I'm just going to sketch in very bare outlines something of what is meant by the evolution of consciousness. So a helpful way of characterizing the evolution of consciousness is to contrast it with what's often thought of as the history of ideas. So we all know that ideas about the world, the self, and reality have changed greatly over time. But in the study of the history of ideas, the focus tends to be on how the ideas about the world and ourselves have changed. Whereas in studying the evolution of consciousness, there's the view that not only what we've thought about the world, but our very consciousness, the world, and their interrelationship have transformed over time. So in the evolution of consciousness, through this idea, we see that in prehistory and history, there's a transformation of this very character and quality of consciousness in the world. And the history of ideas is an expression of this evolution and contributes to it as well. It can lead us to ask questions such as the following, because we know that ideas have changed greatly over time, even within a few centuries. And obviously when we look at larger periods, have changed much more greatly. Can ask questions such as the following. How could certain ideas that appeared self-evident to earlier cultures seem so foreign to us today? Why did the existence of God and or gods, depending on the culture, seem unquestionably self-evident? Why was the world understood through myths rather than rationality and logic? Why were the so-called sciences of alchemy and astrology treated as serious pursuits? The concept of an evolution of consciousness makes sense of earlier worldviews through interpreting them as the expression of a consciousness that was qualitatively different from contemporary consciousness, rather than, for example, assuming that earlier views of nature as ensouled or as a manifestation of the divine were based on a projection of human psychology onto a soulless natural world, as we see the natural world often today. An understanding of the evolution of consciousness opens up the deepest perspective that just as it has seemed self-evident to modern Western consciousness that nature is an inanimate mechanism, earlier forms of consciousness experienced nature as theophanic, ensouled, or alive. Perhaps it was just as intuitive to see natural phenomena as more than merely physical, as it is for us to see in a human face the expression of a psychological state. So as I mentioned before, the intellectual consciousness of today is uniquely suited to grasping the physical order. And the beginnings of this consciousness can be more or less identified with the modern scientific revolution and also the Renaissance in part. Steiner and Barfield both identify the rise of rationality in a much broader sense with the emergence of philosophy out of a mythological worldview in the pre-Socratic philosophers of ancient Greece. The further we look back in time, the more expansive and less individual consciousness appears. In the past, human consciousness experienced itself as participating in a divine intelligence and world and was more communal and collective than individual. Steiner suggests that if we trace the evolution of consciousness in reverse order, from the present to the distant past, as we look back in time, we find that consciousness moves from a more rational form to a semi-conscious equivalent of imagination, inspiration, and finally intuition, going very far back in time. Thus, we can think of mythology as an expression of a kind of pre-individuated imagination. Both Steiner and Barfield identify the rise of rationality, philosophy, and science with an increased self-consciousness and a gradual loss of a sense of participation in the cosmos. Modern science has developed a view of the world that excludes the presence of any soul, spirit, or divinity in nature, and thus establishes a strong opposition between and distinction between the human self and the world. And Descartes is a particularly exemplary philosophy in this regard because he thought that nature was just a mechanism or machine, external mechanism, including our own bodies, and he identified the soul purely with rationality and only humans had souls. So this brought out a very strong contrast between self and world. So modern science and thought thus estranges us from the cosmos, but at the same time increases a sense of separate self-identity. And the task of the future is to reconnect ourselves to the larger whole of existence from which we have become divided. So the evolution of consciousness is a descent from a state of unconscious participation and intimate union with the divine that gradually leads to greater self-consciousness and implication in the physical world, and potentially in the future will lead to a self-conscious reascent and participation. According to both Barfield and Steiner, the first stage in the further transformation of our cognitive capacities is imagination, a self-conscious imagination. So having sketched these ideas about imagination and the evolution of consciousness in very bare outlines, I now want to turn to how Barfield applies these kinds of ideas and discovers them through his study of language and poetry. To begin with, for Barfield, the poetic imagination is essentially the mind in its mode of creative discovery. So this is not limited to just poetry. The poetic imagination is responsible for the emergence of new insights in all disciplines. The work of poetic imagination with specific regard to language can be traced through considering cases where one can identify that a word or phrase has been granted new meaning. One of the main ways in which this semantic development, this development in meaning, is achieved is through the use of metaphor. A metaphorical utterance often involves presenting one thing or idea in light of another. For example, Romeo in Romeo and Juliet says that Juliet is the sun, and we as readers are invited to see Juliet as though she held the significance for Romeo's love that the sun has for the earth. In the context of his discussion, I'm going to come back to talking more about the structure of metaphor, but sticking with Barfield here. In the context of his discussion of how new meaning is brought into language, Barfield describes metaphor as the suggestion of an as yet unknown meaning by means of an already familiar meaning. So an example, I'll give a couple of examples for how this occurs. These are examples taken from Barfield. The word gravity prior to Newton meant weight. And in order to articulate his scientific discovery, Newton used the word gravity as a metaphor. So he thus suggested the new concept of gravity through using this already familiar meaning of weight. So his new insight into the physical world was conveyed through this metaphorical usage. Another example Barfield gives is that he explains that prior to Coleridge's time, so the Romantic era, the expression point of view meant one's point of view when looking at a landscape. And Coleridge or somebody else said or thought X, so something as yet unnamed or unfamiliar, is to the mind what point of view is to an observer of landscape. And in so doing, he enriched the content of the expression point of view. So whenever we use the expression point of view, we're kind of indebted to these metaphorical innovations that bring new meaning into language. And this can be demonstrated through many terms in science, philosophy, and colloquial terms. And this is generally recognized by scholars on metaphor today, how important it is to many fields. So in this way, the collective meaning of words and language is enriched and transformed. While the poetic imagination is at work in all disciplines, poetry in the more limited sense is arguably the sphere in which language is most creatively employed in order to generate new meaning. And, especially when you think of great poets, like we think, in terms of all the meanings and words and phrases that Shakespeare coined, for instance. And for this reason, Barfield conceives one of the fundamental tasks of poetry to be the maintenance of the vitality of a language. Poetry is language in a state of becoming and transformation rather than language that is fixed and dead. For instance, language, the cliches we use in everyday speech. Through customary usage, the meaning of words contract, and the once living metaphors become dead metaphors and literal meanings. In our habitual relationship to language, we treat the senses or meanings of words as relatively fixed and unchanging properties, and we give little or no thought to the origin of meanings. When in daily life someone uses the expression, "he was beside himself," or "I don't grasp your meaning," we understand the meanings immediately without having to activate the metaphors from which they derived. However, this fixed relationship to linguistic meaning is for Barfield not only characteristic of everyday conversation, it's also for him the case of the mind in its logical or rational function. According to Barfield, the logical or rational function of the mind enables a reflective self-consciousness, but is unable to create fresh meaning. Think of something like symbolic logic or like pure logic. It's not concerned about meaning at all. It's only the form of the logic. Nevertheless, Barfield does not value one mode of the mind in exclusion from the other, were this to be possible. For him, if we had only poetic minds, we would be creative but unconscious, whereas if we were only rational, we'd be self-conscious but have no content, no meaning. So it might have dawned on you at this point that there's a connection between living metaphor and dead metaphor on the one hand, and what I earlier characterized as living thinking and thought on the other. For Barfield, the poetic imagination is a form of living thinking, and poetic language could be called living language in contrast to dead language. In the essay Speech, Reason and Imagination, Barfield writes the following. As users of language, the poet and the logician stand at opposite poles. To the logician, those words are of most value which change their meaning as little as possible when they are used in different contexts. The poet likes meanings which change most and is always trying to change them further himself. The logician tries for statement, the poet for suggestion. But the object of this digression was to point out that while this other kind of thinking, namely living thinking, is certainly not expressible in words taken in the first sense, it has a very close connection indeed with words taken in the second sense. There we should listen for its voice. In short, the poetic language gives voice to the living thinking of poetic imagination. And this is the first respect in which I think we can say that the poetic imagination can contribute towards the development of a cognitive form of imagination. While metaphor is a major source of new meanings in language, Metaphor also presupposes existing meanings. As we saw, it takes a familiar meaning and uses it in a new way to suggest the as yet unknown with what is already familiar. So for this reason, metaphor cannot be the origin of all meaning in language. This gives rise to the question as to what was the character of the earliest meanings in language. Now, a lot of authors on this subject hold the view that we first have purely literal meanings, and these literal meanings apply to purely physical characteristics and objects in the world and actions. And these old physical meanings, literal meanings, were then applied metaphorically to suggest what is immaterial, psychological, spiritual, abstract, and so on. And thereby these immaterial meanings are introduced into language. Now, Barfield's very critical of this view, and because this view of the universe, let's call it for the moment, physicalist view of the universe, is something that's only arisen in fairly recently in human history. And so to think that the earliest meanings were physical in this way is a projection, an anachronistic projection of modern consciousness onto the distant past. And he has very interesting discussions of individual words and how we should understand them in contrast to this in their very old meanings. So one of his most striking examples is the Greek word pneuma, and its Latin equivalent spiritus, and you find this in other languages as well. The ancient Greek word pneuma and the Latin spiritus can be translated as breath, wind, or spirit. And Barfield criticizes the views of Max Müller, who held that the literal meaning of wind or breath must have first existed, and then this was applied to suggest metaphorically spirit or the principle of life, some early conception of the spirit. So in Poetic Diction, he criticizes this view as follows. Such a hypothesis is contrary to every indication provided by the study of the history of meaning, which assures us definitely that such a purely material content as wind on the one hand, and on the other, such a purely abstract content as the principle of life within man or animal, are both late arrivals in human consciousness. We must imagine a time when spiritus or pneuma, or older words from which these had descended, meant neither breath, nor wind, nor spirit, nor yet all three of these things, but when they simply had their own old peculiar meaning, which has since, in the course of the evolution of consciousness, crystallized into the three meanings specified. In other words, pneuma points to a distinctive meaning in which the outer reality of wind and the inner reality of spirit were not yet divided. In order to distinguish these meanings from modern metaphors, Barfield sometimes uses the word figurative to describe them. For ancient consciousness, it is as if everything naturally had what today we would call a symbolic meaning, but not a symbolic meaning that was put there or projected onto the world by an individual consciousness or subject. And one need not actually go back that far in time to find examples of this pre-dualistic or figurative kind of meaning. I'll just give a couple of examples, we could give many examples, but in medieval physiology, for instance, the body's internal organs and fluids were associated with distinctive emotions. Thus we have the word choleric, and the French have en colère, meaning to be angry. Choler etymologically has the meaning of bile, which was associated with anger in medieval medicine. So there's this union of emotional characteristic with a physiological one. And a contemporary example, which I think still has something of this unity between the inner and the outer, is the word heart. When we use the word heart at once as an emotional and a physiological centre. It is in this sense that is conveyed. It is this sense that is conveyed by expressions such as "you broke my heart" or "I am heartsick." We tend to still think it's somehow, physiologically, I think, here that we feel, right? And it's both, to some degree, physiological and emotional, inner and outer. Barfield, drawing on the anthropological writings of Lévi-Breuil, refers to ancient consciousness as one of original participation. Original participation is not something that arose through a special conscious act. Thinking and experiencing were not yet as experienced as possessions of the individual mind, but as divinely granted, and human beings experience themselves as incorporated into the whole of existence. This unity comes to be divided by the discursive intellectual mind, and meanings are divided or polarized into the inner and outer senses, these meanings that crystallize here with pneuma. This brings about a loss of participation and alienation of the human from the world at large. And it is only once this has occurred that this view of metaphor is suggesting the immaterial by means of the material is true. It's true of many modern metaphors, but we shouldn't project it onto the distant past as the origin of meanings, of certain meanings in language. So, for instance, the act of physically grasping was first used as a metaphor, and to say, in the sense of expression, is like to grasp the meaning of something or to grasp something more abstract. However, in this divided consciousness, once inner and outer become divided, Barfield also finds a deeper task of metaphor and the poetic imagination, which he names final participation. And it's here that poetry and modern poetry becomes significant. Final participation relates to what Barfield calls, in poetic diction, a felt change of consciousness, which occurs in the shift from the sort of intellectual state of mind or prosaic state of mind to a poetic one. The experience that he had in sort of being immersed in reading poetry and how that differs from our ordinary ways of thinking today. While the prosaic consciousness regards the world as a universe of disconnected physical objects, poetic metaphors and symbols restore connections between the inner and the outer and the diverse phenomena of the world. This poetic consciousness bears an affinity to original participation, but with important differences. In Poetic Diction, Barfield writes, "Men do not invent those mysterious relations between separate external objects and between objects and feelings or ideas, which it is the function of poetry to reveal. The language of primitive men reports them as direct perceptual experience. The speaker has observed a unity and is not therefore himself conscious of relation. But we, in the development of consciousness, have lost the power to see this one as one. Now it is the language of poets, insofar as they create true metaphors, which must restore this unity conceptually, after it has been lost from perception. Imagination can see the relationships again." So again, could offer many examples from modern poetry to illustrate this. I'll just mention the poem The Rose Interior by Rilke. In this poem, Rilke metaphorically describes a rose as an interior lake that mirrors skies or heavens, Himmel. German word suggests both. And in another poem, The Bowl of Roses, similarly suggests that roses contain, quote, the vague influence of distant stars. Perhaps these metaphors and images are not the invention of unprecedented connections between phenomena or merely emotive statements. Perhaps they are better understood as imaginatively reconnecting the inner and the outer, and as suggesting relationships between the above and the below, the botanical and the astronomical, that were a given for the ancient mind. It should also by now be evident that what Barfield means by true metaphors is very similar to what is commonly known within esotericism as correspondences. There are important differences between the unified meanings given in original participation and the connections restored by the poetic mind and language. Firstly, the unified meanings of original participation are to a large extent given or divinely granted, whereas final participation is far more dependent on the individual act, on the imaginative act of an individual mind. Secondly, poetic metaphors reconcile the inner and the outer and other divisions that have resulted from the discursive intellect. But they do not completely identify the reconnected elements. This is true of the self-world relation as well as the relations between the various aspects of the world. In original participation, there is a union of consciousness with the whole of existence that only has a dim awareness of any distinctness of the individual self. In final participation, the awareness of a distinct self that has arisen with the help of philosophy and science is not dissolved back into the one. Rather, it is preserved while at the same time establishing a renewed sense of connection to the world. There are other respects in which I think it's important not to emphasize unity at the expense of differentiation and vice versa. If we only see a particular thing as a manifestation of a unity, we annihilate that which makes it a distinct thing. Conversely, if we only see a thing as an isolated particular, then we fail to understand how it is intimately connected to everything else in the cosmos. What we need then is a reconciliation of self and world that does not extinguish the self in a union with the absolute, and a vision of the interrelationship of things that preserves their particularity without disconnecting them. So I'll soon turn to how Goethe can assist us in this task. But before so, I want to look a bit closer at the structure of metaphor. And this will connect up with Goethe. So ostensibly, metaphor, as we have seen, has the structure of the proposition or statement that A is B or A equals B. What do I mean by this? For example, in the famous words of Romeo as he secretly watches Juliet on her balcony at night, Shakespeare writes, Juliet A, so the term A, is the sun B. However, a metaphorical utterance need not explicitly state that A is B. For instance, we can refer to someone as having a radiant smile, and we are thereby suggesting that the smile is like a source of light that radiates without saying, the smile is a source of light or something like that. While the external form of an explicit metaphorical utterance, such as Juliet is the sun, does not differ from a literal statement such as Juliet is a woman, they're identical insofar as they appear in the external form, or one of strict identity like a bachelor is an unmarried man, we know in interpreting a metaphor that there is not a literal identity between Juliet and the sun, or A and B. While the utterance ostensibly says A equals B, we know there is also the implication that A is not equal to B. Juliet is not literally the sun. However, a metaphor does not wholly specify in what respects A equals B and A does not equal B, but rather maintains an openness and indeterminacy. As a reader, I have to be creative in interpreting a metaphor, in finding the illuminating connections between A and B, but also becoming aware of how A and B are not literally the same. So I know Juliet resembles the sun in the radiance of her beauty, let's say, but she doesn't emit, huge amounts of heat. And obviously we do this at a more subtle level, and obviously with a great immediacy in an intuitive way when we understand a metaphor. So there's both relationship and differentiation. And a simile, just for those wondering how simile relates to a metaphor, haven't thought about these terms for a while, is usually in the form of like. So Juliet is like the sun, or the implication of a similarity. And that tends to both relate A and B, but hold them a little bit further apart from each other. So I now want to turn to how this understanding of metaphor as a differentiated interrelationship can be deepened through Goethe's understanding of metamorphosis. So it's getting sort of more concrete. Goethe's understanding of metamorphosis is very large significance for understanding the whole of reality. But the clearest and most accessible place to introduce it is through what he says about plant metamorphosis. So while in a plant, unlike a frog or butterfly, the tadpole doesn't literally become the tadpole literally becomes a frog, or the caterpillar literally a butterfly. This doesn't happen in plants. But nevertheless, Goethe saw a metamorphic continuity between the various forms of a plant. While a leaf does not become a flower, as a tadpole turns into a frog, we can understand the plant better as a whole when we see, for example, how in an ideal sense, the form of the flower is the metamorphosis of the leaf. According to Goethe, the metamorphosis of plants takes place through phases of expansion and contraction, as well as what he calls intensification, or Steigerung in German. The seed for Goethe is the plant in its most contracted state, and the condition in which the being or essence of the plant is most concealed, most hidden. The unfolding of leaves is a process of expansion in form. The formation of the calyx is a contraction. The petals an expansion. The stamens and pistil a contraction. The fruit an expansion. While the various parts of the plant differ and are distinct, Goethe illustrates how all parts of the plant can be imaginatively perceived as the metamorphosis of a protean leaf form, and thus as an expression of an ideal whole. The calyx can be viewed, for example, as contracted and circularly arranged stem leaves. The petals as coloured and refined leaves, the stamens as contracted petal forms. Think of how the pod of a bean or a snow pea, to offer another example, resembles leaves folded together with the seeds between them. Through his understanding of metamorphosis, Goethe neither separates the parts of the plant into disconnected particulars, nor does he treat them as manifestations of an abstract oneness. Rather, they appear as parts of a continuum in formation and transformation, of interrelated differentiation. And it's in the flower that Goethe thinks the plant comes to its greatest intensification, kind of self-expression or self-revealing. In the Maxims and Reflections, he writes, in the blossoms, the vegetative law, by which he means like the essence of the plant, enters into its highest appearance. So while this metamorphic intensification occurs within the single kingdom of plants in innumerably varied ways, I think it's a key to seeing differentiation and relationship across the whole of reality. So how does all this relate to metaphor? Firstly, just as the perception of a metamorphic intensification enables the recognition of a deep relationship and difference between A and B, leaf and petal, for example, an apt metaphor suggests both an illuminating relationship between A and B, while also acknowledging their differences. Secondly, metaphors that are united with an understanding of metamorphic intensification can serve to reveal deep connections across diverse forms of existence. And this is something that plays a large role in my poetry. So now I'm going to turn to some examples from my poetry a few examples that express this coupling of metaphor and metamorphosis. So the poem Grasshopper in a Field in my book Paths of Flight presents a clear instance of how the Goethean notion of intensification can shed light on metaphorical interconnections between the kingdoms of nature. So it's a very short poem. Grasshopper in a Field. Who took the young thin stems and bent them to be your legs, folded leaves like origami to make a pair of wings? I found you, a green ear of wheat mounting a stalk, a walking plant, self-enclosed, unbound from the soil. Early sentience at home in your hall of mirrors. When we think of animals, our first thought tends to be of mammals, complex warm-blooded creatures that manifest a sentient awareness that to some degree resembles the human. Insects, in contrast, seem almost as close to plants as to more complex animals. The poem Grasshopper in a Field presents an intimate connection between the botanical and the animal. The grasshopper is presented as though it is an intensified plant, a plant transformed into a self-enclosed, mobile whole that possesses a primitive sentience as if the insect were a higher fruit of the plant, a green ear of wheat. Of course, no one literally constructed the grasshopper out of plant parts, but its legs are depicted metaphorically as thin stems and its wings as folded leaves. These metaphors suggest an interconnectedness and differentiation between insect form and plant form. The poem Elegy for the Earth, from my second collection, A Personal History of Vision, offers more complex examples of this kind. This poem, which personifies the earth as a dreaming woman, includes the following stanza. Becoming realities, her dreams transmute the coruscated surface of the sea into the scales of fish, dark ripples of an overcast day into a humpback's ventral pleats, raise fins into the air so they turn into wings of gannets and gulls, their flight the sentience of winds. While a goanna, moulded in lichen-covered stone, basks in warm rays, the mammals embody its longing, the fire burning in the cave of their ribs. The first 6.5 lines focus on relations between animals and their environments, the resemblances of fish and whales to the appearances of the sea, as well as analogies between the relationship of fins and water and wings and air. Wings are not only adapted to the air and wind, birds in their animal awareness of flight are also presented as an intensification of air, as though the winds were thereby raised to their own consciousness, the sentience of winds. In Grasshopper in a Field, the grasshopper is depicted as though it were a plant that had become self-enclosed. In comparison to an animal, even an insect, the plant resembles an organ more than a self-contained organism. This principle of self-containment, what is perhaps better described as the principle of internalization, also achieves increasing complexity within the animal kingdom. And this applies to the human as well. Thus, the lizard, the exothermic goanna in Elegy for the Earth, absorbs warmth from the sun and regulates its body temperature through this external relationship. In endothermic mammals, including human beings, in contrast, the regulation of body temperature has become largely internalized. This intensification of internalization is captured in the metaphor of the fire burning in the cave of their ribs. The lizard's external relation to the fire of the sun is internalized in the case of the mammal. Not only mammalian and human biology, but also human culture can be understood as an intensification of nature. In particular, my poetry often describes natural processes as if they were artistic processes and vice versa. Goethe tersely encapsulated an aesthetics of this kind in his characterization of art as the spiritual organic, as one united compound, spiritual organic. In other words, the work of art is a creation of the human mind that at the same time embodies the principles of organic nature. In the poem Rain and Memories, I liken the process of sculpting clay to embryogenesis. We used to make sculptures out of clay. Under the press of finger and thumb, moist earth passed through a sequence of forms, akin to clouds in a windy sky or phases of an embryo, until it attained its fired shape. Other poems depict finished works of art as expressions of natural processes. In the following metaphors, a sculpted head of Zeus is portrayed as a concentrated embodiment of elemental nature. His locks are swirling cumulus, the curls of his beard entangled waves whisked by winds. In the poem Val di Noto, Sicily, the Baroque cathedral of San Giorgio, quote, crowns the town of Mordicca with a flowering spike. The hilltop architectural structure is depicted as though it were an inflorescence of the entire landscape, an artistic intensification of the surrounding flora. Such images are not intended as simply descriptions of past cultures, but also as symbols and ideals of a future culture that lives in greater harmony with the natural order. I will conclude with a discussion of my poem Augury, which explicitly addresses the art of poetry. I wrote this poem on the Greek island of Samothrace, which was one of the most important religious centres in ancient Greece. It was home to the Samothracian mysteries, which are actually older than the Eleusinian mysteries, which were of equal significance in the ancient world. The title of the poem, Augury, alludes to the ancient prophetic art of divining the future through interpreting the flight of birds, and that plays on this idea. The poem depicts a walk in the mountains and various encounters with birds. Here I'll only read a short excerpt. It's quite a long poem. Lifting my head, I see two blackbirds with wings outstretched, arcing more smoothly than figure skaters, away from then towards each other. Their fingers almost touch as they pass and arc out again. I follow the fluent sequences in the impromptu choreography. Goes on, the image gets elaborated, but I'll stop there. The birds are first likened to and described as moving even more smoothly than figure skaters. This comparison becomes a metaphor in that the primary wing feathers are depicted as fingers, as though they were the fingers of figure skaters reaching out as they pass each other. The likening of bird flight to art becomes more explicit in the metaphorical depiction of the fluent sequences in the impromptu choreography. While the birds are not literally performing a choreography, their graceful flight seems to the speaker to embody the perfection of art in a form that is not consciously intending to be art. In the larger context of augury, these descriptions also have a bearing on the art of poetry. Early in the poem, the speaker is occupied with, quote, recurrent doubts about the art of poetry, its prospects in our time. The subsequent fortuitous encounters with birds seem to respond to these doubts, to augur well. In writing the poem, I also aspired to capture the character of their flight in words, to intensify their flight in the form of human language. Augury suggests the ideal of a poetry that manifests the principles and beauty of the natural order and thereby reconnects the human and the natural world. I hope that these examples from my own poetry have served to build on the earlier thoughts about poetic imagination and the evolution of consciousness that I drew from Barfield. I wanted to just pursue one direction in which I've explored this in more detail and more concretely. So my aim has been to illustrate something of the work that poetry can do to overcome our sense of alienation from nature and the world, reconnect nature and spirit, and reveal the otherwise hidden connections between things. In these respects, poetry can assist in the further evolution of consciousness, in the transition from intellectual consciousness to cognitive imagination, from alienation to final participation.
I literally don't have any way to formulate words for this question, I guess, but let me just try. I'd say maybe a little less than halfway through you were talking about how, as opposed to having something real in the real world be the first thing, and then someone comes along with a metaphor based on that, what you were saying is the form is there with or without the concrete object needing to be there. Because I always think of a metaphor as, something I know, and then I'm using that to represent something else. But you're saying it's the other way. It's not that.
No, it is that. But I'll try and make some of those distinctions clearer. So, that the way metaphor generally works is through bringing two things into connection with one another. It suggests a new, if it's a really original metaphor, it suggests a new meaning through an already familiar meaning. But then the question arises, what is the origin of the meanings of meanings, to begin with? So these are questions about sort of like the origins meaning in language. And one way in which that's thought, and the way people often think about metaphor, because we have so many metaphors, which are taking something like physical and using it metaphorically to imply something non-physical. They think that this must be the sort of origins of meanings in language. And Barfield's criticism of this view is that he thinks that's right about a lot of modern metaphors. But the further we go back in time, the more it becomes the wrong way of conceiving things. Namely, because there's this idea that a perception of the purely physical is somehow basic, right? Behind that view. Whereas for Barfield, that view of the world as being purely physical is a very modern development. So to assume, to project back in time, that's how things began, is to project our modern consciousness, take it entirely for granted, and just project it back onto the distant past and say that's how these meanings, sort of immaterial meanings, first arose. And through relying on ancient texts and other things, Barfield thinks that all the evidence points to the idea that this way of distinguishing between the physical and the immaterial, material and the immaterial, the literal and the symbolic, let's call it, is actually a modern development. And what we find when we look further back in time is that there weren't, the way I sort of tried to convey it is it's like things just naturally had a symbolic meaning. There wasn't, but it's sort of not quite right to say it's symbolic because it's not. We have to sort of think ourselves back before the emergence of our sort of modern intellectual consciousness. Similar with the difference between, I think, myths. The further we go back in time, there's a distinction between. A difference between myth and, say, modern poetry, because modern poetry is contrasted to a non-poetic consciousness, whereas a really mythical culture is like through and through mythical. There's not some, and similarly, the meanings are all of the words are going to have this richness and not yet separate. The way out things that we think of external sort of have a kind of depth to them that they've lost with time. I hope that makes it a bit clearer, but there are quite a lot of distinctions going on there.
Like a little follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Just if we can record it, please.
So, now taking ourselves back to that time before where our minds are now with metaphor, is it like say we were just beings or minds, forget being, like we're just minds, so we contain what we contain, and that's there with or without like an earth, let's say. So if we were on a whole nother planet, we still have that information, and what's on that planet would just connect with, we would just connect with that to explain it. It's like a language of mind or something like that. Is that, or there's these archetypes that with or without, are, they're there, and we just use the objects in our world to kind of tell us that they're, a way to perceive it, a medium or something.
That's going back further, perhaps in time than I sort of feel like I'm competent to talk about. I stick more to what's still kind of within historical record. So to try and to give an example from a little bit of what I meant by that the meaning is sort of given in what Barfield calls original participation, or in the ancient past. You can take, and that's possibly overstating it, because it's not like the mind of the individual was totally inactive or something and totally passive. But take the example, for instance, of the role that inspiration has played in poetry. And if you look at, Homer, for instance, sing, O muse, of the wrath of Achilles, and so on. There's a sense in which the poet writes, the muse has to sort of, be there and dictate what the poet writes. And if you look at a modern conception, like the role of inspiration in modern poetry, it's virtually either poets don't think there is any inspiration, or it's become something much more like individual and psychological and without reference to, a metaphysical, mythical, figure of a muse, which is, taken obviously seriously in Homeric Greece. So you can see that what happens is that the mind becomes more individualized, and we start from a sense of being more disconnected and having to individually create, and less of a sense that we're just receiving. It's being active, but nevertheless, say receiving inspiration. I mean, you can give many examples for how this has changed. I mean, I think in more traditional cultures, another thing is that there often tends to be the kind of, moral laws of that society and all the things that are taboo, and that's just something that everybody accepts, and there's not, and that's another way in which a certain culture is participative, but without yet the individual experiencing themselves as separated from the collective.
I don't know if I missed the point or not, but I think what you're trying to say is when they said Juliet is the sun, at one point, he believed that Juliet was the sun, was the actual embodiment of the sun. As we've progressed backwards, it's more like saying Juliet is like the sun as opposed to saying Juliet is the sun. Am I following?
Okay, I'll just say something to that, and then if you've got further question, then add it, because I think that's important to clarify there. So, I mean, Juliet is the sun is, of course, from Shakespeare, and in this sort of trajectory, Shakespeare is, a modern poet and, very influential in the formation of sort of modern consciousness. So we should understand that in terms of a, more, modern understanding of how metaphor functions. But the example of sun and light is a good one, because we have lots of modern metaphors about things like to shed light on a subject matter, to illuminate something. So these I think largely can be understood as metaphors in a modern sense, that we're taking something external, that we think of external as light, and applying it to something abstract like the mental illumination or illumination of something through thought. So that would be the more modern situation. But if you look at a lot of ancient cultures, then the sun might be totally identified with the divine or with thought, or and so that's, for Barfield, something more like what he calls a figurative meaning, or before we'd sort of divided those two apart. So in that situation, it's sort of like, maybe. The problem is we can't sort of place ourselves entirely back into the past, because we're living with the benefits or the developments and the divisions that have occurred through history. But you could say that, originally what Barfield means is there was a unity. So like maybe something like light and thought in certain cultures were, or spirit, or in certain cultures, similarly to the word pneuma for wind and breath and so on, were kind of perceived or experienced as a unity, and we've gradually separated those two things out. So we don't think them of a unity. And if we use them now as a metaphor, we kind of reconnect the two, but it's not quite the same as going back to thinking that light is, that there's some unity before that division happened. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Luke. I wonder if it is true that this is a consciousness that we are evolving towards. I wonder if there is a way, for us, not necessarily poets, that we can rekindle or stimulate this way of living thinking within ourselves. Not all of us are meant to be poets, but I don't know if you understand my question. Is it a way that I can become sensitive to this spoken word or to this way of thinking that perhaps is beyond the ordinary? And is it accessible to all the lay people, all to the ordinary human beings that are aspiring to get there as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there are lots of ways, and poetry is one way. But something I would also stress, which I was trying to indicate when I was first talking about metaphor introducing new meaning, is that through reading poetry, you don't have to write poetry, you're also activating that more living, creative thinking, insofar as the poetry, the new metaphors and so on introduced by the poet you can't just understand them passively in the way that we often relate to meaning. And so one way among many others is to read poetry. I don't think all poetry does this, but some poetry. But I mean, I think there's a big contrast between, for instance, popular music and poetry. And particularly today, I mean, there are some good songwriters who have good lyrics, but most of the lyrics you hear in popular music today are basically like strings of, cliches. It's almost like, you could cut up various, cliche phrases, put them in the hat, shake them around, and then reconnect them, and you've got the lyrics of a pop song. And I had experiences, I was sort of doing poetry retreats, and then suddenly like being in a taxi or something and hearing a pop song, and just like, and that's like meaning, and that's like language in this really dead, state. And in that sense, I think poetry, I guess more serious poetry, and the difficulty of poetry as well. A lot of people don't want to read poetry because it makes more demands on our thinking and activity of interpretation and so on than other kinds of texts. But I think there's other things we can do. I mean, I mentioned Goethe's approach to nature and science, and generally being more attentive, more contemplative, making the effort to think, not just getting lost clicking on, I don't know, clicking on one thing after another on the internet. By no means is poetry the only way. But I think, the thing for Barfield as well is that in any creative kind of endeavour, in a way, this poetic imagination is at work. So it's poetry in the more narrow sense is one specific place where living thinking or poetic thinking expresses itself.
Does philosophy and philosophical thinking activate the living thinking within someone as well? Or can it in certain cases?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to some extent it does, and I would relate this also to Barfield's view that that the imagination and reason are always working together in some way. Otherwise, we would have, we'd either be like dreaming and not really conscious with the imagination, or have only purely formal content, like pure logic. So I think insofar as philosophy is concerned about is concerned about grasping reality, insofar as I think a philosopher has to be imaginative to come to a new vision of the world. And metaphor is also very crucial to philosophy. That's and science, as I indicated with science. I mean, another nice example of an early metaphor is the first, so the concept of matter can be dated basically, or maybe there are other languages in which it can be traced, but Aristotle coined the word for matter, and the word he used was wood. That was the metaphor he used, was for wood. And for him, everything consisted both of matter and form. And so you can see how he took that image of wood, and that became a metaphor for matter. But you find this in a lot of philosophy. So I think in various ways it's at work in philosophy. And certainly insofar as philosophy is difficult and requires us to really think, I think it does play a role in this kind of enlivening of thinking. But I think it can also play, I noticed this in myself, and you see it in some other poet philosophers, like Coleridge really experienced this strong tension between, at various points, imagination and reason, that I think philosophy does also create this stronger sense of self that can also come to feel a bit cut off from the world.
So you made a comment about, you kind of sketched out this linear progression from a more sort of metaphorical connection to, or symbolic relation to the world and with language in the past, moving to a more sort of literal, scientific, rational present, and sort of wondering where you see that, where you see us heading in the future, what our relationship to that will be. It seems like we would like to see sort of a reconnection with nature through poetry, through the imagination. But you could also see that linear progression continuing to some sort of disastrous endpoint of pure rationality and literalism, just wondering how that fits into that scheme.
I think largely it's up to us. What we foster will be, to a large extent, our future. And I think you can see coexisting today both tendencies that lead to further division and separation and breakdown of meaning, and also more creative activities that have an effect of kind of reconciling us to what we've become alienated from. I think the whole environmental movement, for instance, is a good example of a sense of reconnection emerging, but through also the conscience and application of human freedom and responsibility and so on. So I don't think there's any. The future is sort of predetermined, and that's part of what Barfield also means by final participation, in contrast to original participation, that we have to become more active and creative individually than we might have been in the past. But I see, there's obviously plenty of examples we could give for things, breaking down further, into further division and the opposite of something like a more living, imaginative thinking and relationship to the world.